Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, love, and life's most profound lessons. Today, we bring you the story of a daughter's unwavering loyalty, a father's unshakable foresight, and the battle to protect a legacy built on trust and integrity. In the face of manipulation and greed, one woman finds the strength to honor her father's memory and rebuild what matters most. Stay with us as we explore a journey filled with emotions, revelations, and hard-earned victories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story and join us for more inspiring journeys. My name is Sophie Palmer, and I live in Chicago. I've worked as a financial consultant for over a decade. But even with all my knowledge of numbers and investments, nothing could prepare me for the storm that came after my father's death. 3 weeks ago, my world shifted in ways I hadn't imagined, even as I braced myself for it. My father, James Palmer, passed away after a long and grueling battle with cancer. To the world, he was a respected real estate mogul who had built his empire from scratch. But to me, he was Dad, my first teacher, my greatest supporter, and the man who taught me to stand tall no matter what life threw at me. Losing him was like losing the ground beneath my feet. He wasn't perfect. Of course, no one is. After my mother passed away when I was just 12 years old, he carried on as best he could, raising me with as much care and love as his busy life allowed. He didn't have to say it, I always knew he felt guilty about the long hours he spent at work, trying to ensure we had a secure future. But those hours also built the foundation for the incredible bond we shared. When he was home, he was fully present. Whether it was helping me with math homework, cheering me on at school events, or teaching me how to analyze property markets before I could even vote, our relationship remained strong even as I grew older and pursued my own career. But things changed 5 years ago when Diane entered our lives. Diane Harper, my father's second wife, was 15 years younger than him. She worked as a receptionist at one of his properties, and their whirlwind romance took everyone by surprise. Within 6 months of meeting her, my father had married her. I wanted to be happy for him. I really did. He had been lonely for so long. And if Diane made him happy, who was I to judge? But from the very beginning, something about her didn't sit right with me. It started small, subtle changes that most people might not notice. She would suggest my father was too tired for our weekly dinners or claim he was too busy to take my calls. At first, I brushed it off as her being protective or perhaps overly enthusiastic about her new role as his wife. But as time went on, her behavior became more overt. She redecorated the family home, the house I had grown up in, stripping it of all the little touches that reminded me of my mother. She convinced my father to buy her luxury cars and designer clothes, claiming she needed to look the part as his wife. Her spending was extravagant. But that wasn't what bothered me the most. It was the way she isolated him from his old friends, his business partners, and even me. She found fault with anyone who didn't bow to her wishes. And slowly, my father's world began to shrink. I'll never forget the day my father first voiced his doubts about Diane. It was 2 years ago. During one of his chemotherapy sessions, he looked at me with tired eyes and said, "I married her because I was lonely, Sophie. But I won't let my mistake hurt you." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. But over the next few months, his actions made it clear. As his illness progressed, Diane's mask began to slip. She became more controlling, monitoring his visitors and intercepting phone calls. She even tried to stop me from seeing him, claiming he needed rest. But my father was no fool. He started to see through her manipulations and began taking steps to protect what mattered most to him, me, and the legacy he had worked so hard to build. In the months leading up to his death, my father and I had several private meetings in his office. It was during these moments that he opened up about his fears. He told me he had caught Diane snooping through his financial documents late at night and asking peculiar questions about his will. "She's after the money, Sophie," he said bluntly. But I won't let her take what's yours. It broke my heart to see him like that, a man who had always been so strong. Now fighting not just cancer but also the betrayal of someone he had once trusted. But even in his weakened state, he remained meticulous and determined. He worked closely with his lawyer, Richard Clark, to ensure his estate would be protected. The family home, where I had spent my childhood, was secured in my name. He set up ironclad trusts and recorded video testimonies explaining his decisions, anticipating that Diane would try to contest the will. Now, sitting in my apartment, I could still hear Diane's voice from the phone call earlier that day. "We're taking our rightful share of your dad's inheritance. Get out of the house," she had spat, her tone dripping with spite. I had ended the call with a simple, "Talk to my lawyer," but inside, my emotions were a storm of grief, anger, and determination. Diane didn't know what my father had done to prepare for this moment. She didn't know that her attempt to bully me out of what was rightfully mine was about to backfire spectacularly. My father had seen her for who she truly was, and he had taken every measure to ensure that his wishes would be honored. As I poured myself a glass of wine and opened the estate documents, I couldn't help but smile. The next few days were going to be very interesting. The day after Diane's call, I sat in Richard Clark's office. Richard wasn't just my father's lawyer, he was also a trusted family friend who had been by my father's side for decades. He was a tall man with a calm demeanor, and his presence always had a way of making me feel like things were under control. "Sophie," Richard began, shuffling through a stack of papers on his desk. "Diane's lawyer contacted me last night. As expected. They're planning to contest the will. They're claiming your father wasn't of sound mind when he made the changes." I nodded, unsurprised. "Let me guess," I said. "She's also demanding immediate access to the estate." "Precisely," Richard replied with a grim smile. "She's claiming she needs the funds to maintain the house and cover other expenses. What she doesn't realize is that all the utilities and bills have already been transferred to your name." I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction at Diane's ignorance. My father's careful planning had left no room for loopholes. "What's the next step?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "They've requested an emergency hearing," Richard explained. "It's scheduled for tomorrow morning. Diane's lawyer is banking on speed, hoping we won't have time to gather our evidence. But what they don't realize is that we've been ready for this." Richard reached into a folder and pulled out a series of documents. "Medical reports. And USB drives. Your father anticipated every move they'd make. We have video recordings of him discussing his estate plans, medical evaluations proving his cognitive clarity, and a detailed paper trail of his decisions. Diane has no idea what she's up against." Hearing this gave me a sense of both relief and sadness. My father had spent his final months preparing for a battle that should never have been necessary. But he had done it out of love, to protect me and the life we had built together. I knew I had to honor his efforts by standing strong, no matter how much Diane tried to intimidate me. That evening, as I sat at my father's old mahogany desk in his study, I found myself surrounded by memories. The room was filled with the scent of leather and aged wood, and every corner seemed to hold a fragment of our past. On the desk was a framed photo of the two of us from years ago, standing proudly in front of his first real estate project. I picked it up, running my fingers over the edge of the frame, and felt a pang of longing. My father had always been my guiding light. Even now, his words echoed in my mind, "Sophie, sometimes the best revenge is letting people trip over their own greed." I could only hope that he was watching over me as I prepared for the battle ahead. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with Richard by my side. Diane was already there, sitting with her lawyer on the opposite side of the room. She wore an expensive black dress and a polished expression, her confidence radiating through the courtroom like a challenge. Beside her sat her two adult children, who had barely interacted with my father during his life but now seemed eager to claim a piece of his estate. As I took my seat, Diane glanced in my direction, her lips curling into a smirk. It was a calculated move, meant to rattle me, but I refused to let her see even a flicker of doubt. I straightened my shoulders and kept my gaze steady. When the hearing began, Diane's lawyer wasted no time launching into a dramatic monologue. He painted me as a manipulative daughter who had taken advantage of her father's illness, while portraying Diane as a devoted wife who had selflessly cared for my father in his final years. It was almost laughable, hearing him describe a reality so far from the truth. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to remain calm. Richard, however, was unshaken. When it was his turn to speak, he methodically presented our evidence. The courtroom fell silent as he played the first video of my father. In it, my father's voice was firm, his eyes sharp despite the toll cancer had taken on his body. "I am of sound mind and body," he declared. "These decisions regarding my estate are mine alone, and they reflect my wishes. My daughter, Sophie, is my rightful heir. Diane has been provided for adequately through our prenuptial agreement, but she will not inherit my business or the family home." I glanced at Diane as the video played. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Her lawyer shuffled uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for the mountain of evidence we had brought to the table. As Richard continued to present the documentation, including my father's medical reports and recorded statements, I felt a surge of pride. My father's meticulous planning had left no room for doubt. Diane might have thought she could manipulate the system, but she had underestimated the man she married and the daughter he had raised. The hearing wasn't over yet, but for the first time since my father's death, I felt a glimmer of hope. We were going to win this, and in doing so, I would honor my father's legacy in the way he deserved. The evidence Richard presented was overwhelming. The courtroom remained silent as more videos of my father were shown. Each one revealed a man who, despite his illness, was sharp, lucid, and unwavering in his decisions. His words were deliberate, his intentions clear, and his love for me unmistakable. In one particularly poignant clip, my father addressed Diane's likely objections head-on. "I know there will be attempts to undermine these decisions," he said, his voice resolute despite the fatigue on his face. "But my daughter, Sophie, has been my partner in building this life, not just in business but in spirit. She is the one who will carry my legacy forward." I glanced across the courtroom. Diane's composed exterior was beginning to crack. Her lawyer was furiously scribbling notes, his discomfort visible. Diane's children, who had been so smug earlier, now shifted awkwardly in their seats, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Richard wasn't finished yet. He pulled out another piece of evidence, a detailed inventory of financial transactions made by Diane during the months leading up to my father's death. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice steady and calm, "we have evidence that Mrs. Palmer attempted unauthorized transfers from Mr. Palmer's accounts. These include large sums directed to her personal accounts, as well as suspicious purchases made without his consent." The judge leaned forward, studying the documents presented to him. Diane's face turned pale, her confident demeanor replaced by a mix of anger and panic. These transfers occurred just weeks before Mr. Palmer's passing. Richard continued. They coincide with the period when Mrs. Palmer claimed she was too overwhelmed to manage household matters. Diane's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand. "Let the evidence speak," he said firmly. Then came the most damning piece of evidence, surveillance footage from my father's home office. The video showed Diane, late at night, rummaging through his files and opening his safe. The timestamp on the footage matched the dates of the unauthorized transactions. Diane's lawyer looked visibly defeated as the video played, and Diane herself looked as though the ground had been pulled from under her. When it was finally Diane's turn to speak, she stood abruptly, her voice trembling with frustration. "Your Honor, this is all a misunderstanding," she said. attempting to mask her desperation. "I was only trying to ensure the household was taken care of. My husband trusted me, he promised me security." But the judge remained unmoved. "Mrs. Palmer," he said, his tone measured but firm, "the evidence suggests otherwise. The financial transactions, combined with the video footage and Mr. Palmer's clear statements, indicate a pattern of behavior inconsistent with your claims." As Diane sat back down, her lawyer whispered something urgently in her ear. She brushed him off, her expression one of pure defiance. I couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Diane's downfall was inevitable. But it was heartbreaking to see how far she was willing to go to manipulate and deceive. The judge called for a brief recess, and Richard and I stepped outside the courtroom. The cool air was a welcome relief from the tension inside. "You're handling this remarkably well, Sophie," Richard said, his tone reassuring. "Your father would be proud of you." "I hope so," I replied, my voice steady but soft. "This isn't just about the inheritance. It's about protecting his legacy and everything he stood for." When we returned to the courtroom, the judge wasted no time delivering his ruling. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, I find no reason to contest the validity of Mr. Palmer's will," he announced. "All assets and properties will remain as designated in the will." A wave of relief washed over me. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned to Diane, his expression stern. "Furthermore, I am ordering a full audit of all financial transactions made by Mrs. Palmer during her marriage to Mr. Palmer. Any evidence of fraud or unauthorized transfers will be referred to the appropriate authorities for investigation." Diane's face turned crimson as the weight of the ruling sank in. Her lawyer quickly began gathering his papers, already sensing the battle was lost. Diane's children sat in stunned silence, their earlier confidence completely shattered. As the courtroom emptied, I felt a profound sense of closure. My father's meticulous planning had protected his wishes, and Diane's attempts to exploit his memory had only served to expose her greed. But more than that, I felt a renewed determination to honor my father's legacy not just through the inheritance, but through the values he had instilled in me. The battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. It was time to rebuild, to heal, and to carry forward the lessons my father had taught me. And for the first time in weeks, I felt ready to face whatever came next. As the dust settled, I stood in the house that had been my family's sanctuary, now fully mine, a symbol of justice, love, and resilience. My father's voice echoed in my heart, reminding me of the values he had lived by: integrity, perseverance, and the courage to stand against wrong. Diane's schemes had unraveled, exposing her greed and deception for all to see. While the journey was painful, it solidified the bond one shared with my father and gave me the strength to continue his legacy. This story isn't just about inheritance, it's about love, loyalty, and the profound lessons life teaches us through its trials. Thank you for watching Life Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to discover more stories of courage, resilience, and inspiration. Stay tuned for our next journey into the heart of human experiences.